Are we on the verge of a truce in the Middle East? The violence since October the 7th has claimed over 34,000 Palestinian lives in what is very much a one-sided bombardment of the Gaza Strip by Israel. It all began, of course, with the horrific attack launched by Hamas on southern Israel that killed around 1,200 mostly civilians, and at least 250 Israelis were taken hostage. Around 100 remain in the hands of Hamas somewhere in Gaza. This Tuesday, Antony Blinken arrived in Israel, having been in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia yesterday, and Amman, Jordan earlier this Tuesday. The US Secretary of State is adding his diplomatic weight to the push for peace. His angle: Hamas should accept a 40-day truce and release the hostages. Israel, says Blinken, has done nothing but defend itself. But behind closed doors, the US, including President Joe Biden, is uncomfortable with how Israel has attacked hospitals and civilians in Gaza in the name of eradicating Hamas. Before we get the take of our special guest, France 24's James Vassiner has more on the context.
With a deal on the table, one of Israel and Hamas's highest priorities remains the recovery of hostages and prisoners held by either side. According to the Wall Street Journal, Israel's military would be prepared to put down its weapons for 10 weeks if Hamas agrees to free 20 Israeli hostages. The Times of Israel puts this number at 33. In exchange, Israeli television Channel 12 states it would release 900 Palestinian prisoners, which would amount to 27 to 45 prisoners per Israeli hostage. Officials are reportedly expecting a response from Hamas by Wednesday night, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been meeting with regional leaders to press Hamas to accept the proposal. But the group has so far made it clear it would only accept a deal based on a permanent ceasefire, as well as the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Hamas also wants all displaced people to be able to return to their homes across the Strip, including the 1 million people currently sheltering in Rafah. But Benjamin Netanyahu has made one matter clear: ceasefire or not, the Israeli Prime Minister plans to destroy Hamas's battalions in the southern city.
James Vassiner giving us some more context before we bring in now Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. Hussein, thanks for joining us here on France 24. We always appreciate your time, sir. Thanks for being with us.
Of course.
Are you optimistic about the chances of a truce this week?
No, I think we're closer than we've ever been in terms of bridging between Hamas and all parties except Israel. The problem is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been reacting to the prospect of a ceasefire, hostage agreement, something like that, with the most bellicose rhetoric that he's come up with in a long time. You know, as if he wanted to discourage Hamas from making such an agreement, he would make exactly the comments he's making now, that he's going to go ahead no matter what, and that it doesn't matter whatever is agreed to in Cairo or through Qatari brokering or anything like that. The Israelis are going to go ahead into Rafah. Now, that's probably true, and I don't think he needed to say it. I think everybody knows that. But when you put it that way, you give everybody, especially Hamas and all the other people involved in the negotiations, the sense that you're not serious and you're being very belligerent and that you're not interested in an agreement.
It sounds like then that Netanyahu is the main obstacle. Why has this become the case? What is driving him?
Well, I think partially Netanyahu believes that the best way to stay out of prison is to stay in power, and the best way to stay in power is to keep the war going. Moreover, he is wedded to the idea that there can be no reasonable solution in Gaza other than really essentially an Israeli reoccupation of the Strip, and then extending that into the West Bank, canceling the Oslo agreements and imposing direct Israeli security control in the entirety of the West Bank, canceling Area A, where the PA is, and all of that. That's basically his position. So he's being as aggressive as possible, short of demanding annexation in the West Bank, which is the official position of the government, and it's his official position. He's just not saying he's going to do it in the near future. It's aspirational. Hamas, though, also is an obstacle in the sense that they continue to demand the release of prisoners and who are not acceptable to Israel, and also to demand a full ceasefire that they know they're not going to get. So unless both Israel and Hamas pull back a little bit and are willing to give ground in order to, in the Israeli side, get back hostages, they won't get them all, but they could get a lot of them, who are being still held and who are still alive. And for Hamas to win some breathing space for itself and for the long-suffering people of Gaza that they plunged into this nightmare back on October 7th, we're going to see the continuation of the war. And so these two parties are the main obstacles. And it's a great tragedy that the two groups of people who could bring an end to the conflict, or at least a long pause in the conflict to let everybody breathe and not die, are Netanyahu and the people around him on one side, and Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, and the people around him. And they are also the only two groups of people who matter. So it's a terrible situation.
No matter what the US says, no matter what Qatar says, no matter what Egypt says, as you point out, Sinwar and those around him are the ones that matter on the Hamas side. Netanyahu and his... It's the most far-right coalition in Israeli history, isn't it, what we're seeing right now in Israel?
Absolutely. It's
and that's at the root of the matter on that side, isn't it?
That's right. No, without doubt. I think you phrased it very well. You have the most extreme faction in Hamas ever, in terms of Sinwar and Mohammed Daif, the head of the Qassam brigades, on the one hand, and the most right-wing, intransigent, and bloody-minded Israeli government bent on annexation in the West Bank on the other hand. And these are the two groups of people who are running the war, and they are the only two groups of people in the world who don't want the war to pause or end. And that's the irony.
What about the other actors in this? I'll use the phrase theatre of war, but it's not theatre, it's actually reality, isn't it, of course? Yeah. The other actors in this, Iran, Lebanon, Yemen's Houthis. Give us a sense of what this means from their perspective.
Well, I think it's a very big crisis for Lebanon and for Hezbollah, because I think from the beginning, there were people in Israel, mainly Defense Minister Gallant, who thought that Hamas was small potatoes and the real threat to Israel is Hezbollah and its 150,000 rockets and missiles right on the Israeli border. And they're right, that is the biggest threat. But it's been clear from the beginning of this conflict on October 7 that Hamas, backed by Iran, wanted nothing to do with a new war with Israel under current circumstances. But there have been people in Israel, led by the defense minister and others, who have wanted to proactively take the war to Hamas, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and maybe even drag in the United States. And now the Biden administration is convinced that maybe Netanyahu wants to drag in the Americans and end up with a confrontation with Iran and get the long hoped for U.S. strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities as a kind of distant goal, and at a minimum to degrade, destroy, and humiliate the military of Iran's most potent proxy in the region and Israel's most powerful enemy in the immediate term, which is Hezbollah. The thing is that this is the biggest nightmare of the Biden administration. The whole U.S. policy since October 7 has been conflict containment. Whatever happens in Gaza, the U.S. can deal with it. And it's all sort of manageable. But if the conflict spreads, especially into Lebanon, it's not manageable. And Biden's right about that. But there is the possibility that Israel agrees with Iran that the Iranian side is winning here because they don't care about Gaza and they don't even really care about Hamas, which is an unreliable ally. And what they would really care about is an Israeli attack that degrades and destroys Hezbollah, and that would then rejigger the regional scenario to make this a real loss for the Iranian side, and that Israel has a real interest in doing that. If that's true, that puts the Biden administration at loggerheads with its biggest partners, more even than its adversaries. And it means the biggest threat to U.S. policy comes not from its adversaries, but from its allies.
Hussein Ibish, we could go on, but sadly time against us. Thank you, sir, for sharing your analysis with us. Fascinating as it is. And you say you're not optimistic. Let's hope perhaps there is some development that gives us a reason to be so. But I completely understand where you're coming from, sir. Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on France 24. We always appreciate your time. That's it for this apropos. We, of course, will watch for all developments on the situation in the Middle East. We take a very short break after that. It's